Welcome back to this Facts Over Feelings episode here on the 90s podcast station. And today we are here to clear up some ambiguity in the tax space. I want to talk to you about what most of Americans are probably never thinking about. Who is actually doing your taxes? Because we use terms like accountants, CPAs, tax advisors, bookkeepers, and enrolled agents, and it's almost interchangeable. But I'm going to talk to you about that today because just because someone has a CPA doesn't mean they specialize in taxes. And just because someone has a PTIN and can legally prepare your taxes for compensation doesn't mean they have the same credentials or representation rights as a CPA or an enrolled agent. So here, on this episode of Facts Over Feelings, we're going to be talking about CPAs, enrolled agents, and tax preparers, and people operating under primarily a P10. And more importantly, we're going to understand what makes them different and why it matters who handles your taxes. So, without further ado, come on in. So I want to start here. The CPA, Certified Public Accountant. Now, I'm going to make this very clear. Not every CPA understands or does taxes. Some of them work in the corporate sphere for companies on this, maybe they're CFOs or something, right? They do accounting. It's a misconception. It doesn't mean they're a tax professional. A CPA is an accounting professional licensed by the State Board of Accountancy. Generally, becoming a CPA requires significant college level accounting education, passing the CPA exam, satisfying experience requirements, and meeting the licensing and requirement in a particular state. Not only that, but also some CE or continuing education that is very, very diligent. It is a serious designation, but here's where people get confused. Accounting is an enormous profession. You have CPAs working in auditing, corporate financing, financial reporting, government accounting, forensic accounting, consulting, internal controls, and yes, some work in taxation. But simply having a CPA behind someone's name does not automatically mean that person spends every day working on individual income tax returns and understands every tax issue relevant to your particular situation. Think about it this way. If someone tells you that they're an attorney, your next question probably should be, what kind of attorney are you? A divorce attorney and a securities attorney both went to law school, but they're both attorneys. But you probably don't want a security attorney handling your divorce. The same concept applies here. A CPA who spent 20 years auditing financial statements may be extremely accomplished, but doesn't necessarily make that person the best professional to handle complicated individual tax returns. On the other hand, there are CPAs who spend their entire careers in tax. Individual taxation, business partnerships, trust and estates, corporate returns, tax planning. These individuals have tremendous tax experience. So when you're hiring a CPA for taxes, don't stop at, are you a CPA? Ask, what percentage of your practice is actually tax? That's a much better question. Now, let's talk about the enrolled agent, which I hold. An EA, enrolled agent. This designation doesn't have nearly the same recognition with the general CPA, but here's what makes it interesting. The EA designation is specifically centered around federal taxation. Enrolled agents are federally authorized tax practitioners. The credentials, they're administered through the IRS. There are generally a couple of ways someone can become an EA. The route many people are taking is passing the special enrollment examination or the SEE. SEE. That examination covers individual taxation, business taxation, and representation practices and procedures. There's also a pathway for certain former IRS employees based upon their experience. Once someone becomes an enrolled agent, they are continuing education requirements to maintain that status. 72 hours every 3 years. This is one of the biggest differences I want people to understand. The CPA credential covers the broader accounting profession. The EA credential is a tax credential. That doesn't mean an EA automatically knows more about taxes than every CPA. No, absolutely not. There are CPAs who have practiced tax law and tax accounting for decades and have extraordinary knowledge. It means you're looking at two different professional credentials with two different origins and scopes. The CPA is licensed at the state level. The EA is federally authorized by the IRS. And both CPAs and EAs generally have unlimited representation right before the IRS. That last part matters. If you get audited, have a collection issue, or need someone qualified to represent you before the IRS, an EA can generally represent taxpayers before the IRS, just like a CPA can. A lot of consumers don't know that. They hear enrolled agent and they think of somebody working for an insurance company. No. We're talking about the federally authorized tax practitioner. But now we got to go to the alphabet soup of everything. We're talking about what we call a PTIN. This is where things get really interesting. Prepared tax identification number, a PTIN. If you're paid to prepare or substantially assist in preparing federal tax returns, generally you're required to have a PTIN to get paid. But understand this. This is very important. A PTIN is not the same thing as a professional designation. It does not make someone a CPA. It does not make someone an enrolled agent. And obtaining a PTIN by itself does not mean someone has completed the same examination, education, licensing, or continuing professional education requirements associated with those credentials. This is where you can find a wide swath of people out there. You have an experienced tax preparer who has been preparing taxes for 25 years. You may have a bookkeeper who has also prepared taxes and tax returns. You have someone working for a seasonal tax preparation company. You have somebody relatively new to the industry. They call themselves potentially having a PTIN. And that's why simply asking, do you prepare taxes, doesn't really tell you much, if anything at all. Here's another major distinction. An unenrolled return preparer generally does not have the same unlimited representation rights before IRS as an attorney, CPA, or an enrolled agent. There's limited circumstances where certain preparers may have limited representation rights. But that's very different from the broader representation of authority of credentialed practitioners like CPAs, attorneys, and enrolled agents. That doesn't mean someone with only a PTIN is automatically a bad preparer. No, it does not. I'm not saying that. I want to make this very clear. Some people have prepared taxes for decades and know their particular niche very well. And on the other side, having letters behind your name doesn't automatically make you good at your job. Credentials establish a baseline. They don't establish competence in every situation. So let's talk about tax planning versus tax preparation. This brings me to this bigger issue. There's a big difference between the two. Tax preparation looks backward. What happened last year? How much did you make? What deductions and credits are available? What forms need to be filed? How much do you owe? Tax planning looks forward. What happens if we do a Roth conversion this year? What happens if we sell the business? Should we realize capital gains this year? Should we bunch charitable deductions? How does this decision affect Medicare IRMA 2 years from now? How does changing the structure of the business affect payroll and income taxes? What happens if I retire in December versus January? Those are very different conversations that need to be had. And you have somebody who is phenomenal at preparing tax returns, but doesn't do much proactive tax planning. That's not necessarily a criticism. Nonetheless, there are different voices, different services, different recommendations. The problem occurs when consumers don't understand the difference. You drop your documents off in February or March. Someone prepares your return. They tell you you're getting a $4,000 refund. You celebrate, but nobody ever asks whether you could have made a different decision 6 months ago to save that money by yourself. You're giving the government free money. By that time, you're preparing the return. Most of those decisions have already been made. So the question remains, who should you hire? I can't say that because I'm biased. I'm not going to tell you that everybody needs to be a CPA. I'm not going to tell you that everybody needs to be an EA. And I'm certainly not going to tell you somebody is incompetent simply because they don't have their designation. Your situation should determine the professional need. If you have a W-2 couple, a couple of 1099s, and relatively straightforward return, you may not need somebody specializing in complicated taxes. But start adding complexity. You own a business, you own properties, whether it be rental properties, you have partnerships, you're exercising stock options, you're selling a company, you're dealing with trust, you have significant investment income, you're approaching retirement and considering a large Roth conversion, or you're having problems with the IRS. Now, I want you to know a lot more about the person sitting across the table from you. Not just, do you prepare taxes? I want to know, what are your credentials? What do you specialize in? How long have you worked in situations like mine? Do you primarily prepare returns, or do you provide tax planning? Do you provide tax advice? If there's a problem with the IRS, can you represent me? And most importantly, do you actually understand the issue I'm hiring you to solve? These are the questions you need to be asking your tax preparer. Nothing more, nothing less. We all deserve better. The letters behind someone's name, they matter, but they don't tell the entire story. A CPA is in a highly regulated accounting credential, but not every CPA specializes in taxation. An enrolled agent is federally authorized tax preparer, tax practitioner, whose credential is specifically focused on taxation and the IRS representation. And a PTIN allows someone to prepare your federal tax returns for compensation. That's basically it. But a PTIN is not a professional credential comparable to becoming a CPA or an EA. There are excellent professionals in every industry, every corner of the industry. There are people who probably shouldn't be handling complicated tax situations. Your job as a consumer is to understand the difference. So the next time someone tells you, I've got a tax guy, maybe ask them one more question. What exactly is your tax guy? Because when you're trusting someone with your income, your business, your retirement, and potentially your relationship with the IRS, that's probably something you should know. Thank you guys for listening to Facts Over Feelings. Subscribe to the 9 Innings Podcast. Until next time.